Selena Not Afraid's case is one example of challenges Native women face. Homicide is the fourth leading cause of death in the U.S. for persons under age 20. According to a 2019 report, approximately half of all cases involving murdered Indigenous women in Montana have officially been misclassified. Some causes of death officials have ruled for such cases include suicide, overdose, or exposure to the elements. Indigenous people are also more likely to be reported missing than white women. According to the 2020 census, Indigenous individuals account for 1.1% of the U.S. population. Yet, as of June 2023, of the 23,300 missing persons included in the National Missing and Identified Persons System, 820, which is 3.5%, were identified as Indigenous people. This means Indigenous persons are more than 3 times more likely to go missing than the general population.
Native Americans make up 6.7% of Montana's population, but account for 26% of missing person reports. And while local officials claim that causes for these deaths and disappearances are varied, from drug trafficking to domestic violence, the one thing they all have in common is that they take place in a jurisdictional minefield. Depending on where someone is reported missing or where a victim is found, it could fall to either state, federal, or tribal authorities to investigate. And with that many intersecting agencies, there are plenty of cracks for these cases to fall through.
An Indian reservation, for all intents and purposes, is a sovereign nation. It is subject to completely different laws, governing bodies. They're like a country within a country. It can be very difficult.
Responsibility might fall with the county sheriff's department, officers from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the tribal police. Sometimes the FBI also steps in. There are both too many agencies jockeying for authority and not enough resources to go around.
While there are only a limited number of studies on media coverage of missing Indigenous cases, the Urban Indian Health Institute study showed that more than 95% of cases were never covered by national or international media. In this study, only 1/4 of the total number of cases were even covered by local or regional media, much less by national media. The data provided in the Wyoming Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples report presents statistics regarding missing and murdered Indigenous people and the news coverage those cases received. They found that only 30% of Indigenous homicide victims received newspaper or media coverage, compared to 51% of white homicide victims. Indigenous female homicide victims had the least amount of newspaper or media coverage, at 18%. Another study compared media coverage of 10 missing white women to 10 missing Indigenous women. Every missing white woman had a dedicated Wikipedia page, while only one of the missing Indigenous women did. And this was only because she was a celebrity of sorts.
They said Henny was just one of those crazy little girls that would take off. So what?
We would never accept this if, for example, these young girls were non-Indian. But yet here in southeastern Montana, we've accepted that negligence is okay. What is happening with all of these systems that are supposed to be in place to keep people safe?
There's also been national recognition of the problem. In October, President Trump signed 2 bills into law, the Not Invisible Act and Savannah's Act, named for Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, a 22-year-old Spirit Lake Nation woman who was found murdered in 2017. The laws direct the Department of Justice to create more coordinated law enforcement and data collection in response to missing Indigenous persons.
To understand why these disparities take place, feminist theorists like Sarah Crawley and her colleagues help us examine that the issue goes far beyond individual newsroom decisions. Crawley argues that feminist work must expose the power structures that shape whose stories are presented to the public and whose are essentially erased. Crawley explains that what often passes as neutral or unbiased reporting actually masks deep cultural favoritisms about whose lives are valued, whose victimhood is seen as relatable or tragic, and whose suffering is deemed unremarkable. Therefore, when Indigenous women receive little or no media attention, it reflects a long-standing colonial pattern within our culture and media. These patterns have historically positioned Indigenous communities at the margin of society, receiving little to no public concern or attention. To feminist theorists like Crawley, this lack of coverage is not random. It is rooted in systematic ideas about community. Crawley also emphasizes that feminist work should be action-oriented, meaning it should not simply describe inequality, but actively seek to challenge it. Linking this research to the topic of missing Indigenous women, this appears to be a critical point. Media coverage has the ability to influence the urgency of police investigations, the level of public pressure on specific cases, and the resources devoted to finding a missing person. When Indigenous cases receive little to no coverage, the impact is real. Slower response times, less accountability, and fewer people searching for leads. Through Crawley's framework, we begin to understand that increasing media visibility isn't just about representation. It is part of pursuing justice for communities whose voices have long been ignored within society. Exploring the disparities and underrepresentation of missing and endangered Indigenous women in national media and news coverage today is a subject I feel personally drawn to. I have always held an interest in human rights, justice, and keeping up with the latest true crime news. Hoping to one day help others advocate for their rights in this field, I knew this topic was a great way to combine my interests and an interdisciplinary approach. This issue is complex, and 15 minutes is not nearly enough to dive into the entirety of it. The issue contains subtopics such as ethical media coverage, power struggles within our government, basic human rights, freedom, the economy, sociological issues, the justice system, and others. Media studies alone is not enough to alter the course of this issue. Indigenous people have long struggled with the reality of being marginalized in the U.S., dating way back to the colonization of our nation. This is definitely not a new pattern. Acknowledging that this underrepresentation in our society is taking place is an important goal. The more difficult challenge is establishing how to make changes, draw more attention to this subject, and urge others to be passionate and help advocate for change. As simple as this sounds, I don't have a solution to present in this podcast. What I can do is help shed light on this problem, present my research to others, and hope that others will join me in contacting their representatives to seek change.